Let me begin. I feel a bit bad for barriers. You know, this whole theme of smashing and bashing and breaking barriers, as I put in there, really it doesn't sit well with me. So perhaps I'm the Lorax, or maybe I'll become the most unpopular person here, but I want to speak for the barrier. And the reason, I'm not talking about just any barrier. I'm talking about like those multi-generational, started by great-grandparents barriers, probably some phobic reaction to something kind of barrier that got laminated with all kinds of laws and stereotypes. And the reason I love them is right behind them is this mega reservoir of pristine opportunity. And so, really it does create some pretty terrific things. And I know that because we're going to get into it. I'm going to speak first person about the benefit of catching a wave as a reservoir is breached, because they don't just collapse, they kind of start opening up and you start to see the momentum and the flow through. But first I want to make reference to the two companies because they both benefited from these barriers opening up. And briefly, the first one, Martello, is a software company, and it's in that fun business where people no longer want to buy phone systems, they just want the benefit, which means they get this cloud thing, and that's complicated and it needs a lot of software. And so we've been able to grow as the fastest growing company in Ottawa for the last 3 years at about 600%. And then the one which I promise I'm not talking software the rest of the time, I'm talking pot. The second one is in this situation where we've become the biggest lawful provider of marijuana, for sure in Canada, and probably in the world. And by starting in Canada, we have an opportunity to take over the world. And that one's called Canopy, but a lot of you would know it as Tweed. And many of you might think of it as the company that moved into the Hershey factory in Smiths Falls. And one of the benefits of putting marijuana inside a chocolate factory is you now fully understand why the Oompa Loompas were so happy. So, before I was in both types of high tech, pause, you'll get it. I was a chicken farmer, and every day I had to go around and pick up barriers. Now, these beauties are white because the chicken that laid them was white. You may or may not have known that. They have a wrapper on the outside which actually seals in the egg's freshness. And like all good barriers, when you crack them, you get right in the good stuff I was talking about. Now, if I put one more in there, and a bit of sugar, and a bit of chocolate, a bit of flour, maybe a good dash of marijuana oil or hash, and whipped it up, you would now have a terrific hash brownie. And I share my recipe with you, not that I'm an avid cook. I share it with you because in order to get in this business, you have to disarm a lot of people. You have to make sure that they become comfortable and recognize that there's a big transition afoot. And what I'm going to describe in the subsequent slides is the opportunity that happens when you're there early and when you navigate quickly. And in order to raise our credibility, I'm going to introduce an entrepreneurial icon who I would like to call a very good friend of Canada and Tweed, Mr. Snoop Dogg. And I now know what faux shizzle means, which is cool. He is a global entrepreneur who for many, many years saw that the barrier, the prohibition around marijuana was going to change. And he was an advocate who somehow crossed all kinds of boundaries. He was able to be a musician, an artist, a sports caster, someone who, when Burger King decided they were going to sell hot dogs, who did they call? The Snoop Dogg. And when Old Navy decided they needed a Santa Claus this past Christmas, who did they pick? And so I bring it forward because Snoop Dogg saw the world changing, and he saw a company in Canada that was leading the change in the world, and he picked us to be his partner for the next 3 to 5 years. And so it's kind of a good start to credibility that comes from all quarters. So, barriers. What's it look like, and how do you catch the wave that first comes over the barrier? And I can tell you that the wave for marijuana actually was blue. And when I say blue, I mean like Tory blue. Many of you guys would think that the night of October 19th, when Justin, came in and he won, and everybody was happy. I was happy, but that wasn't the beginning. All the heavy lifting in order to make recreational access happen in Canada was done by the Tories. Now, why would Mr. Harper be the person most likely to be attributed with having created the framework for Justin to succeed in creating marijuana recreationally managed? And the reason was, and the story of Tweed begins with a newspaper. And I was bored, and I was reading newspapers. And I saw an article that said the police chiefs of Canada are no longer going to ask their officers to enforce the marijuana laws of Canada. Interesting. Read on. The reason was that there were 36,000 people who had acquired the right to grow marijuana in their home or designate others to grow it for them. Wow, how do you get that right? Immediately crossed my mind. And I dug a bit further. It turned out that Canada was the second country in the world to have provided recreational access to marijuana. And they did so not out of charity, but because the Supreme Court of Canada recognized marijuana, in fact, had medical benefit, and under human rights, you could not deny access to marijuana. Where it became interesting is the bureaucratic response to that court ruling was, well, congratulations, we don't have any marijuana, you should grow your own. So were the people sick, or did the ruling cause them to become sick? You guys pick. The fact, however, was it became quite complicated for police because you don't need to inform the policeman that you have medicine in your medical cabinet, nor do you need to inform them that you have the right to grow marijuana. So when someone would report that they smelt marijuana growing and that they thought it was bad, they would show up, kick in the door, find out it in fact is a Parkinson's patient growing his own. So it became too complicated. And my observation was that the Tories love the cops. Cops hate the rule. Tories are going to make a new rule. How big's the market? Turns out $10 billion. So remember why I like barriers? There's a huge reservoir. In Canada alone, a $10 billion market was pooled behind this barrier. And the only people who could access that $10 billion, by the way the rules were set, were criminals. Let's see, do people like marijuana? $10 billion says yes. If they make an orderly supply chain, are the people currently growing it in their basement likely to do it the way Health Canada wants? Probably not. And is there really an incumbent supplier who's going to dominate? No. Okay, race on. And so that's what the barrier starts to look like. Now, the little twist that came along is the bureaucrats did a terrific job in Canada of setting out the rules of how you would get a license. And our application turned out to be 604 pages, clunk, put it in. And the only problem was that you didn't get a license by writing a 604-page application. You got the right to build a building or take a Hershey plant, retrofit it, and then have a inspector come by with a clipboard and say, pass or fail. So you can imagine organizing capital to go around and say, can I please get $10 million from you so I can build a big thing without a permit that's going to grow marijuana, which you've never heard is legal, and if we do a good job, we might get a permit. And if we don't get a good job, do a good job and don't get a permit, we'll grow tomatoes, we'll sell them for like $100 each, and eventually we'll get your money back. It just isn't going to happen. And so what we had to do was invert the argument to explain to everyone that, in fact, the Prime Minister hates the current rules. They're going to change. And your only question you have to answer is, do people like marijuana, and do we have the competency to get a permit? And thankfully, it turned out yes, and we got out of the gate early. But barriers fall, and barriers are created. The barrier that came behind as the money had to be raised was everyone who wanted a license. Over 1,000 parties applied. But there were only a handful who could raise $10 million. And so there's a barrier that pops up to give you support and opportunity. So you can see why I love barriers. Now, why the heck was marijuana prohibited? Tabooed. And it turns out, well, frankly, like a lot of things that exist as barriers, it's because a bunch of old white guys decided. And so about 100 years ago, a bunch of old white guys in America determined that they didn't like marijuana. Marijuana is what the Mexican guys were bringing across the border when they were relocating to become Americans, and it was part of their culture, where it was essentially part of their core medicine, and it was part of recreation and relaxation. And so because that spooked the old white guys down there and they played on fear, they got laws to prohibit it. And then they got more laws to prohibit it, and then more people who were young got arrested, and disproportionately, the arrested people were of visible minorities, which created a stereotype that said, clearly, this is stuff that's being abused by bad people, and we don't like it. And that went on and on. Nixon had a report presented to him that said, you, Mr. Nixon, should take this off the schedule with narcotics, get rid of it in the same category as cocaine, and not even treat it as a controlled substance. His response was largely that society likes it, relies on it, I'm going to leave it. So the war on drugs continued, and it was treated in the same fashion. But the problem with having a barrier, which is foundation, is old white guys afraid of marijuana because Mexican people like it. Well, ultimately, that causes you to have to look at it in a different way when facts come forward. And there's no way, if a Martian landed on this planet today and they had to choose between cigarettes, which only have the redeeming properties of taxation and a great way to socialize with other smokers, alcohol, which can be fun but makes you fat, kind of hard in your liver, or marijuana, which isn't toxic in the way it interacts with you, may be habitual but isn't addictive, and actually has medicinal attributes which people have identified, whether it's children with epilepsy, other, they would for sure not prohibit it, but it got prohibited. And for me, thank God it did. But what starts to happen is these layers get thicker and thicker until finally they collapse on each other. Well, what's it look like when they collapse or start to break down? It can happen pretty quickly. When a barrier comes down, I don't know, ask the Berlin Wall how fast a barrier can drop. Really fast. And in the case of this, it started to happen globally, but in quite a disorganized way, and Canada's the first country to do it in an organized way. And is it likely we're going to, patch those cracks up and the barrier will stay up? Pretty unlikely. 70% of Canadians 18 years and older have, in a recent poll, said that they are in favor of managing recreational access so that it's taxed and legal. Why? Well, I think we've proven that criminalization is good for criminals. $10 billion says so. I think we've figured out that, in fact, criminals don't ask for age of majority, so they're pretty happy to sell it to anybody. And I think Canadians have generally figured out that if they tax it, they can build the things they want. And so in almost every circumstance, it's not about the product, it's about the problems of not controlling it. So I really don't think we're going to see it go up. And I do think we're going to see Tweed and some of the other players build a dominant brand in Canada, because my competition on branding marijuana has typically been a Ziploc bag with a bit of an in. And that is not exactly a high bar to clear. So we have an opportunity to create a dominant brand because there are none. And we have a global opportunity where we are hosting people in Canada who come from all countries. So it's interesting when the Germans come over and the regulators want to understand what it looks like. It's shocking to me when the Jamaicans arrived and their legislators asked, how can we manage and grow marijuana? I'm like, well, we can talk about regulation. I think you got the growing thing historically figured out. But that's the kind of framework attraction that Canada's created, which is why we're going to have a global headquartered company here, which become multi-billion-dollar companies. So in the short term, one of the goals of Canopy is to be the biggest market cap company in the Ottawa region, and then you start to think about bigger and greater goals. There's a lot of value still behind that reservoir. It's just really starting to trickle over. But I don't want to leave you without work. So let's think about barriers that you have to consider. And the first one may be related to recreational access of marijuana, but driverless cars seems like a brilliant kind of tie-in to me. Seems fairly obvious, doesn't it? All the stone people in California are like, how am I getting home? Because if you meet stone people, they're not aggressive compared to drunk people. They want to go slower. But I say that in that I can't even talk on my cell phone in a car, yet we completely accept that driverless cars are acceptable. And so there's going to be something that you have to contemplate how it fits together. A carbon tax. It's barely being built. Probably a good idea. But it's billions and billions of dollars that are going to be exchanged. Which side of the barrier do you want to be on? How are you going to work through it? I know people get excited when I say free trade, but the Trans-Pacific Free Trade Agreement is the first time in a generation that the dairy management and supply system in Canada is being questioned, altered, and challenged. So think about it. We're one of the few countries in the world which constrains the supply of a milk product so that it can only be a certain number of things and for a certain number of cows for a certain number of people. That's going out the window. I don't know, cryptocurrency. If I was running a bank, I'd be pretty interested in what the hell is going to happen there. I don't know when. We have to think about how, but there is a barrier to access of capital, the transit of capital, the methodology of exchange, everything around inflation and hedging. We got to be thinking about that barrier changing. Digital identity. Everywhere we go, we are somebody. How much and how we present ourselves is going to change everything about how we interact and how we interact with different societies, different, I'll call it national and transnational groups. And honestly, if I asked 20 years ago at a forum like this, how soon would the first black president be first replaced by the first woman president? I bet I wouldn't have many people who want to bet that that's going to happen. And so I think we're seeing barriers everywhere, change, transition. And the question is, which side are you going to be on? So I'd like to thank the barriers. They've created terrific opportunities for all of us. I hope that you won't feel that I'm the Lorax who's chosen to cheer for the wrong team, and that you'll look at the barriers in a slightly different way. Thank you.